let's look at the second case that Singer considers in this chapter. Singer tells us that he is inspired in framing this case by a case that was described in a book by Peter Unger, another philosopher, called Living High and Letting Die. So this case revolves around this individual, Bob. Now, Bob is living a stable life of relative comfort. Bob is making enough money, for instance, that he can save up a significant sum of cash that he then uses to buy a collector's car, a Bugatti, that he buys both for its pure enjoyment value. He enjoys driving it, maintaining it, and owning it, but also as an investment that he wants to rely upon to help secure his continued existence in relative comfort when he retires. So it provides a certain amount of guarantee for his future comfort. So Bob buys this car, but Bob isn't so well off that Bob can secure insurance for the car, so that if anything happens to the car, then Bob will be deprived of both the pleasure that Bob gets from owning and maintaining it, and deprived of the financial security, the guarantee of his future life, living a level of relative comfort that he's become accustomed to. Bob's out driving one day, parks the car, goes out. While Bob's away from his car, he sees a child who's stuck on the railroad tracks. A train is speeding toward the child. Bob realizes that train will kill that child, but he also realizes that he could flip a switch, divert the train, and save the child's life. However, if he flips that switch, he also realizes that the train will be diverted and it will strike and destroy his Bugatti, his car. Thereby, it will deprive him of the pleasure he gets from owning and maintaining it, and it will deprive him of all those financial resources that he was hoping to use to secure his continued comfortable existence into retirement. So it threatens both his current happiness and his future potential to live at the same sort of level of comfort that he's been living at. In the story, Bob, in fact, explicitly chooses not to flip that switch, allowing the child to die and thereby saving his car from destruction. So Bob, seeing both possible choices clearly, knowing the consequences of flipping the switch or not flipping the switch, makes a conscious choice, knowing those consequences, to allow the child to die by not taking action, thereby maintaining or preventing harm from coming to his Bugatti, and therefore maintaining his ability to enjoy it, both driving and maintaining it, and to have that financial security to ensure his continued comfort throughout his retirement. So Singer again thinks that we have relatively strong uniform intuitions about Bob, namely that Bob did something that was morally wrong, ethically incorrect, and blameworthy. And Singer wants us to understand the case and why that is. So what are some of the salient features of the Bob case, and in particular differences from the Dora case? Well, to start off, Bob is in a better position than Dora is at the beginning of the story. Bob's living a life of relative sustainable comfort. Bob looks like a citizen of a wealthy, industrialized Western democracy, for example. Bob makes more than enough money to cover his basic needs and is able to save up a lot of money to help secure his future comfort at that same level and to get this luxury item that gives him his great enjoyment. Bob's connection to the individual who is harmed by his, in this case, inaction, is very indirect and distant. So Bob doesn't talk to this child. Bob doesn't know the child. Bob doesn't interact with the child in any way other than seeing the child and not acting. So Bob doesn't have a direct connection to this individual. Whereas Dora is acting in a way that really brings about the harm to the child in her story, Bob isn't taking any direct action to harm the child. He's harming the child through his inaction. That is, by not doing anything, harm is done to the child. However, Bob plays no active role. None of Bob's actions are responsible for the child being put in this situation. Bob isn't creating the situation or facilitating the harm that's done to the child. Bob is simply refusing to prevent that harm. So Bob is engaging in inaction. He's not creating the situation, and he is not actively harming the child. Also different from the Dora case, Bob has a lucid, clear insight into the consequences of his actions. Bob sees the two choices available to him. He sees what the consequence of each choice is. There is no ambiguity about what Bob knows when Bob makes his choice. And so, unlike the Dora case, where there is some ambiguity about what she really knows or should know or should suspect, Bob is crystalline clear about the two options, flip the switch, not flip the switch, and about the consequences of each of those two options. So Bob's making a clear, informed choice. Finally, Bob makes this clear, informed choice to not act, to allow the harm to fall to the child. And the benefits that Bob gets aren't an increase or augmentation of his lifestyle, right? But instead, Bob gets the continued enjoyment from his Bugatti, so he maintains his current level of comfort, and he also acts in a way that will secure or make more likely that he'll be able to continue to live sustainably at that level of comfort into the future. So Bob and Dora are different in a number of ways in terms of their insight into their situation, in terms of how their actions result in harm, in terms of their connection to the individual, in terms of their initial lifestyle or situation, and in terms of how their actions result in a benefit or not to them. Now, Singer wants to argue that in both cases, we have a clear and uniform intuition that these individuals acted in a way that was morally, ethically blameworthy. They were acting immorally. What they did was wrong. However, he wants to argue that these cases are really just instances of the situations that are described by the premises of the simple argument. So he's been thinking, right, that the simple argument is theoretical, it's abstract. People might not want to accept the conclusion. They might therefore be disinclined to accept the premises if they aren't compelling. And so he wants to use these cases to support that. But he's aware that people might also object to the cases themselves. And so he considers a number of objections to the analysis that he's made of these cases. And the first objection, right, is that, look, Bob's case isn't really like someone in a relatively affluent country donating to overseas AIDS organizations that might not actually save anybody. So the idea here is that Bob knows exactly what the consequences of his actions are going to be. There isn't any ambiguity or probability involved, really. It's a clear-cut choice that he's well informed about. But that's quite unlike the situation that the person in the industrialized first world country, for instance, is in when they're making a choice about whether or not to donate their disposable, expendable income to an overseas aid organization to try and alleviate poverty or famine or preventable diseases. So because these two cases are different, right, because in the Bob case we have a sort of certain understanding of the causal relationships, the consequences of the choices, then it's disanalogous to the case of a person in a first world country. They don't know for sure just what's going to happen. And Singer responds to this kind of objection and to claims that the cases are disanalogous to the case of the average person in a relatively affluent country. And in this particular case, the way he argues against that disanalogy is to point out that while there may be some difference in the certainty with which we can expect the consequences of our actions in the Bob case versus the average citizen in an affluent country, that there is also a difference in terms of what is being asked of these two individuals. So Bob is being asked to sacrifice this source of joy, his Bugatti collector automobile, that also provides him with financial security potentially into the future that he wants to use to maintain his level of comfort in existence. So Bob's being asked to sacrifice a lot. And Singer points out, look, the person in the affluent country who's being asked to make a donation to save the life of a child, just a single child, is being asked to sacrifice maybe $200. So in this way, the risk that they're taking is dramatically less than the risk that Bob is taking. And even though Bob is sure he's going to lose his Bugatti, and the person in the first world country is sure they're going to lose their $200, right? The person in the first world country isn't sure that the child is going to be saved, but Bob is. However, Bob is risking a lot to save the child, whereas the person in the first world country is risking a little to potentially save the child. So what Singer essentially argues is that the net value is got to be roughly equivalent, that they're not being asked to make a dramatically large sacrifice, and their potential benefit, the potential positive outcome, is dramatically large. And hence, in that situation, right, even though there's less certainty of an outcome, there's so much less risk that it's laughable to suppose that they should refrain from their action because they're not guaranteed of saving the child's life. So Singer says, look, $200 is all that's at stake, and a child's life is the potential benefit. Then it's laughable to suppose that, well, that's just too risky. We can't really argue that that's going to be a rational choice to make.